The incident. Officer Tim Walker prided himself on his role as a guardian of Brilliant Grove, the most affluent and exclusive neighborhood in the city. As he eased his patrol car through the meticulously manicured streets lined with grandiose homes and well-trimmed hedges, Tim scanned the area with his usual vigilant gaze. Brilliant Grove was pristine and orderly, and it was his job to keep it that way. He was proud of his record, 20 years of spotless service, a reputation as a fair but firm cop, and a sense of duty that fueled his every action. That morning, Tim had started his shift with the usual rounds, nodding at familiar faces and making mental notes of anything unusual. He took his role seriously, not just as an enforcer of the law, but as a guardian of the neighborhood's standards. Brilliant Grove was for a select few, and Tim believed it was his job to ensure the residents' peace and safety remained undisturbed. But today, something caught his eye. A beat-up sedan parked outside one of the wealthiest homes on Oakwood Drive. It was an unusual sight in a place where most residents drove high-end luxury cars. A frown settled on his face. That car didn't belong here. As he approached the vehicle, a nagging feeling stirred within him. In his mind, people didn't just park old cars in neighborhoods like Brilliant Grove. It was likely someone who didn't belong, a gardener, perhaps, or a delivery driver who'd taken a wrong turn. But Tim's instincts, honed over 2 decades, urged him to investigate. He pulled his patrol car to a stop, glanced around, and stepped out, adjusting his utility belt as he approached the suspicious sedan. Tim's hand instinctively moved closer to his holster. Years on the force had taught him to be prepared for anything. Just as he was about to inspect the vehicle, his radio crackled to life. "All units, be on the lookout for a silver sedan, possibly involved in a shoplifting incident downtown," the voice on the radio announced. Tim smirked. His instincts had been right. This car was trouble. It had to be. He stood there, poised and ready, waiting for any sign of the car's owner. And then he saw him, a young man emerging from the mansion's side door, carrying a large box. The man wore ragged jeans and an oversized hoodie that seemed out of place in this upscale neighborhood. Tim's eyes narrowed as he studied the young man's movements, convinced that he was witnessing something suspicious. Tim took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and called out, "Excuse me, sir. Mind telling me what you're doing here?" The young man, startled by Tim's presence, nearly dropped the box he was carrying. He turned to face the officer, his face a mixture of surprise and unease. "I'm just helping my aunt move some stuff," he replied, his voice shaky. Tim raised an eyebrow, skepticism etched across his face. "Your aunt," he repeated, his tone laced with disbelief. He knew every resident in Brilliant Grove, or so he thought. "Mind showing me some ID?" The young man hesitated, fumbling in his pocket before pulling out a wallet. He handed over a driver's license, which Tim examined closely. The address didn't match, but it did show a local residence across town. Tim's doubts hardened into conviction. This young man didn't belong here. "Look," the young man continued, his voice growing more anxious, "my aunt just needed help moving some things. I'm not causing any trouble, officer." But Tim's mind was already made up. He was certain this was another case of someone trying to take advantage of the neighborhood. "Put the box down and keep your hands where I can see them," Tim ordered, his tone cold and commanding. The young man's face paled, his eyes flicking between the box in his hands and the officer standing before him. "Please, sir," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm just helping my family. I don't want any trouble. Drop the box." "Now," Tim repeated, hand inching closer to his handcuffs. As the young man set the box down, Tim felt a familiar sense of satisfaction. He believed he was enforcing order, preserving the safety and dignity of the neighborhood. This was why he had joined the force, he thought, to protect the people who deserved it, to keep the riffraff out of neighborhoods like Brilliant Grove. His world was black and white, right and wrong, good and bad, law-abiding citizens and potential threats. And in Tim's mind, this young man belonged in the latter category. Just as he reached for his handcuffs, he noticed a figure in the distance, walking along the sidewalk with small, hesitant steps. It was a young girl, no older than 12, dressed in a pink sundress. She looked lost, glancing around as though unsure of her surroundings. Tim's gaze shifted between the young man and the girl, wondering if they were connected. He decided he'd deal with the girl next. 10 minutes later, an unexpected twist unfolds. Tim returned to his patrol car, having let the young man go with a warning and a lingering sense of suspicion. He watched as the young man drove off in the beat-up sedan, leaving him alone in the quiet, tree-lined street. He took a deep breath, trying to shake off the frustration he felt. He knew he'd done the right thing by letting the young man go, but something still didn't sit right with him. As he sat in his car, his gaze returned to the young girl in the pink dress, who was still walking slowly along the sidewalk. She looked nervous, clutching a smartphone in her hands as she occasionally glanced at it, seemingly trying to navigate her way through the neighborhood. Tim's frown deepened. A young black girl, wandering alone in Brilliant Grove and looking as though she was lost. To Tim, it seemed odd, out of place even. He told himself that he was merely doing his job by ensuring she was safe, but a part of him also felt that same old instinct kicking in, the one that told him something was wrong. He pulled up beside her, rolling down the window. "Excuse me, young lady," he called out, his voice firm but not unkind. "Are you lost?" The girl looked up, her eyes widening in fear as she saw the police car beside her. Her hands tightened around her phone as she stammered, I was visiting my friend Emma, and now I'm trying to find my way home." Tim raised an eyebrow. "Emma," he echoed, trying to recall if he knew of any resident in the area with a child by that name. "This is a private neighborhood. Do you live around here?" The girl nodded quickly, her eyes still filled with apprehension. "Yes, sir, I live on Maple Street. My dad is William Richards." At the mention of the name, Tim's suspicion only grew. William Richards was one of the most influential CEOs in the area, a man who owned multiple properties and held sway in the city's elite circles. But to Tim, this girl's story didn't add up. Why would the daughter of a powerful businessman be wandering around alone, looking lost? "Let me see some ID," he demanded, a hint of authority creeping into his voice. The girl's face fell, her lip quivering as she stammered, I don't have any ID, sir. I'm only 12. Tim's frown deepened. He was convinced that something was amiss. In his mind, this girl's story seemed too far-fetched. And so, acting on nothing more than his gut feeling, he got out of his patrol car, towering over the young girl. "What's your name?" he demanded, his voice harsher than he intended. The girl's voice trembled. Harriet Richards." Tim narrowed his eyes. He knew of William Richards, but he'd never heard of a daughter named Harriet. His gut told him she was lying, that she was somehow a part of whatever suspicious activity had been going on in the neighborhood today. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," he ordered, reaching for his handcuffs. The girl's eyes widened in terror, and she took a step back, clutching her phone tightly. "Please, sir," she whispered, her voice choked with fear. "I didn't do anything wrong. I just want to go home." But Tim's mind was already made up. In his eyes, she was guilty, of what he wasn't entirely sure, but he was convinced that he was protecting the neighborhood from potential trouble. As he secured the handcuffs around her small wrists, Harriet's shoulders slumped, and a single tear rolled down her cheek. Tim led her to his patrol car, oblivious to the true identity of the girl he had just arrested, and the life-changing consequences that awaited him in the next 10 minutes. The consequences. Harriet sat silently in the back of Officer Tim Walker's patrol car, her wrists bound in cold steel. She stared out of the window as the familiar streets of Brilliant Grove slipped away, feeling the weight of confusion, fear, and shame pressing down on her small shoulders. She was only 12, and nothing in her life had prepared her for this. The well-groomed lawns and stately homes of her neighborhood passed by, each one a reminder of the life she had known, safe, comfortable, and far removed from the harsh reality she was facing now. Meanwhile, Tim sat in the driver's seat, his expression hard and unyielding. He glanced in the rearview mirror every so often, checking on his young detainee. Part of him felt a twinge of discomfort at seeing her tear-streaked face, but he pushed the feeling aside. In his mind, he was simply doing his job, maintaining order and keeping Brilliant Grove safe. He had no room for sympathy or doubt. He believed that, in law enforcement, you had to trust your instincts. And his instincts told him that this girl's story didn't add up. As he continued driving towards the station, Tim's radio crackled with the voice of the dispatcher, informing all units of a priority call downtown. There had been an accident involving a city bus, and the police presence was needed to control the scene and assist with the investigation. For a moment, Tim considered turning around and letting Harriet go, but his pride and sense of duty held him back. He couldn't let a potential rule-breaker slip through the cracks, not in his precinct. 10 minutes passed in silence, broken only by Harriet's occasional sniffles. Tim's mind wandered to thoughts of how he might file the report, already envisioning the praise he might receive for keeping the neighborhood safe. But his thoughts were abruptly interrupted by the blaring sound of his phone vibrating on the console. He glanced at the caller ID and froze. Chief Dawson. With a sigh, Tim picked up the phone. "Walker here," he answered, trying to sound composed. "Walker," the chief's voice came through, low and tense. "I just got a call from James Richards. His daughter is missing. Says she was last seen in Brilliant Grove." Tim's heart skipped a beat. "Sir, The chief interrupted him, his tone sharp. "He's furious, Walker. Said she was supposed to be back from a friend's house an hour ago. This is James Richards we're talking about, the CEO of Starlight Industries and one of our department's biggest donors. He doesn't make calls like this unless he's genuinely concerned." Tim swallowed, glancing in the rearview mirror at the young girl in the backseat. A sinking feeling began to settle in his stomach. Could it be? "Sir," Tim said carefully, "I picked up a young girl in Brilliant Grove about 10 minutes ago. She said her name was Harriet Richards, but..." The chief's voice dropped to an icy tone. "You're telling me you've detained James Richards' daughter?" "Yes, sir," Tim replied, his voice faltering. "But I thought she was lying. She didn't have ID, and she looked out of place." "Out of place?" Chief Dawson's voice was scathing. "This is Brilliant Grove, not some war zone. Harriet Richards is a 12-year-old girl, and you've just put her in handcuffs because she looked out of place. Tim, do you realize the gravity of what you've done?" Tim felt a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, each one landing with the weight of a hammer. He had misjudged the situation, and now he was in deep trouble. This wasn't just any girl. This was the daughter of one of the city's most powerful and influential men. "Sir, Tim stammered, searching for the right words, but the chief cut him off. "I don't want to hear it, Walker," the chief said. "Turn around, now, and prepare yourself, because James Richards is already at the station, and he's demanding answers." Tim hung up, his hands shaking slightly. He glanced back at Harriet, who was staring at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. He took a deep breath, his mind racing. How could he have made such a colossal mistake? In all his years on the force, he had prided himself on his instincts, his ability to read people, and his commitment to upholding the law. But today, those instincts had betrayed him. With a heavy sigh, Tim turned the car around and headed back towards Brilliant Grove, his heart pounding with a mix of dread and shame. This was not going to end well. 10 minutes later, back at the police station. As they pulled into the parking lot, Tim could already see James Richards pacing outside the station, his expression thunderous. The man looked every bit as imposing as his reputation suggested, tall, with a commanding presence that demanded attention. His suit was impeccably tailored, his jaw set in a tight line of anger. Tim swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Before Tim could even step out of the car, James Richards stormed over, his voice filled with barely restrained fury. "Is this how your department treats innocent children?" he demanded, his voice echoing through the parking lot. Tim opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He could only look down, avoiding the intense gaze of the powerful man standing before him. His face burned with shame as he realized the full extent of his mistake. James turned his gaze to Harriet, his expression softening as he knelt down beside the car door. "Harriet," he said gently, reaching out to touch her hand. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" Harriet nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks as she hugged her father tightly. "I was so scared, Daddy," she whispered, her voice breaking. James held her close, his face a mixture of anger and relief. He looked up at Tim, his eyes blazing with anger. "You're lucky my daughter's okay," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "But this isn't over." Tim felt his stomach churn as he watched James lead Harriet into the station, where Chief Dawson and several other officers were waiting. He knew that his actions had not only put his career in jeopardy, but had also shaken the very foundation of trust that the community held in the police department. As he followed them into the station, Tim felt the weight of his colleagues' disapproving stares. He could hear their whispers, their judgment hanging heavy in the air. He had always been the officer who enforced the rules, who kept Brilliant Grove safe from outsiders. But now he was the one under scrutiny, the one whose actions were being questioned. Chief Dawson was waiting for him in his office, his face a mask of barely concealed fury. "Walker," he began, his voice icy, "I don't think you fully grasp the gravity of what you've done. You detained a child, the daughter of one of our city's most influential citizens, without any evidence or probable cause." Tim tried to defend himself, his voice trembling. "Sir," she looked suspicious. "I thought." "You thought?" the chief interrupted, his voice rising. "You thought a 12-year-old girl looked suspicious, and that justified putting her in handcuffs." Tim looked down, feeling the weight of his shame pressing down on him. He had no real defense. He had acted on his own biases, on his own flawed perception of what didn't belong in Brilliant Grove. And now he was paying the price. "James Richards is furious," the chief continued. "He's demanding an apology, and quite frankly, I don't blame him. Your actions have put this entire department's reputation at risk. Do you have any idea how much damage you've done?" Tim could only nod, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes, sir, I understand." The chief sighed, rubbing his temples as he tried to contain his frustration. "Walker, you've been a good officer for 20 years. But today, you crossed a line. You let your biases cloud your judgment, and you treated an innocent child like a criminal. That's not what this department stands for." Tim felt a pang of regret, the realization of his own actions sinking in. He had always prided himself on being a fair and just officer, but today he had let his own prejudices dictate his actions. He had failed not only himself, but also the very people he had sworn to protect. "Effective immediately, you're suspended," the chief said, his tone final. "Hand over your badge and your gun." Tim's hands shook as he removed his badge and weapon, placing them on the chief's desk. He felt a sense of loss, of emptiness, as he realized that his career, his life, was slipping through his fingers. As he walked out of the chief's office, the weight of his actions pressing down on him, he knew that this was only the beginning of his journey. He would have to confront his own biases, his own mistakes, if he ever hoped to make amends. But for now, all he could do was walk away, carrying the burden of his actions and the knowledge that he had hurt an innocent child. And in the silence of that moment, Tim knew that karma had indeed come for him, leaving him to grapple with the consequences of his choices. A path to redemption. Tim Walker sat alone in his living room, the room shrouded in an oppressive silence. The house, which had once felt like his sanctuary, now felt foreign, almost hostile. Stripped of his badge and his gun, he felt like a shell of himself. Being a police officer wasn't just a job, it was his identity, his purpose. Now he was a man adrift, forced to confront the fallout of his actions. He replayed the events of that day over and over in his mind. The sight of Harriet's terrified face, the fierce anger in James Richards' eyes, and the utter disappointment in his chief's voice haunted him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Harriet's tear-streaked face staring up at him, asking him why he didn't believe her. The guilt gnawed at him, consuming his thoughts, his peace, and his sense of self. 3 days into his suspension, Tim received an unexpected call. The number on his phone was unfamiliar, but he answered it anyway, hoping that it might offer him some reprieve from the crushing solitude of his home. "Hello, Officer Walker," a calm, steady voice on the other end said. "Speaking," Tim replied, his voice rough from lack of sleep. "This is James Richards," the man said, his tone firm but measured. Tim's heart skipped a beat. He had never expected to hear from Harriet's father again. He braced himself, ready for an onslaught of anger, a demand for a formal apology, or maybe even legal action. "Mr. Richards, Tim struggled to find the words. "I'm so sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I truly am." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before James spoke again. "Officer Walker, what you did to my daughter was wrong. It was based on assumptions, on biases that have no place in the world, much less in law enforcement." Tim's throat tightened as he listened. He knew James was right. He had let his biases guide his actions, and it had cost him everything he held dear. "I don't expect you to understand what it feels like to be judged based on the color of your skin, or to live with the constant fear of being wrongfully accused," James continued, his voice calm but edged with a quiet intensity. "But I do believe in giving people the chance to learn, to grow, and to make amends." Tim felt a flicker of hope at James' words. He had been prepared for condemnation, but this was something else. "Here's the deal, Walker," James said, his tone shifting to a more businesslike manner. "You'll be volunteering at our community center, the Richards Family Center for Youth Empowerment. I want you to work with the kids there, many of whom come from backgrounds you probably don't understand. You'll spend time with them, learn about their lives, their challenges, and their dreams." Tim was silent, digesting the proposal. It was an unexpected twist, a chance for redemption, albeit one that would require him to confront his own beliefs and biases head-on. "You'll be working closely with the director, Miss Santos," James added. "She'll show you the ropes. And just so you understand, this isn't optional. Either you take this opportunity to educate yourself and give back to the community, or you face the consequences of your actions. The choice is yours." Tim felt a surge of gratitude mixed with a heavy dose of apprehension. He didn't know if he was ready to face this new challenge, but he knew that he didn't have any other options. This was his chance to make amends, to prove that he could change. "Thank you, Mr. Richards," Tim said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I won't let you down." James' voice softened, just slightly. "I hope not, Walker, for everyone's sake." 2 days later, first day at the center. Tim stood outside the Richards Family Center for Youth Empowerment, his stomach in knots. The cheerful yellow building seemed almost mocking against his dark mood, its bright colors a stark contrast to the anxiety swirling inside him. Taking a deep breath, he adjusted his collared shirt and walked inside. He was greeted by the warm but scrutinizing gaze of Miss Santos, the center's director. She was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, but an expression that conveyed no nonsense. Tim could tell she had already been briefed on his story, on the mistake that had brought him here. "Welcome, Officer Walker," she said, extending her hand. Her grip was firm, her eyes steady as she assessed him. "I've been expecting you." "Thank you, Miss Santos," Tim replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Please just call me Tim." She nodded, her expression softening slightly. "Very well, Tim. Let me give you a tour and explain your responsibilities here." As they walked through the center, Tim couldn't help but feel out of place. The walls were adorned with vibrant artwork created by the kids, and inspirational quotes were painted above the doorways. He passed classrooms filled with children and teenagers of various ages, engaged in activities that ranged from reading to coding to creating art. He saw children laughing, others focused on their studies, and some just enjoying the company of their friends. It was a world he had rarely glimpsed in his career as a cop, a world filled with hope, ambition, and resilience. Miss Santos led him to a small classroom at the end of the hallway. Inside were a group of kids ranging in age from about 8 to 14, all seated in a semicircle, chatting animatedly. As soon as they noticed Tim, their conversations quieted, and they looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Kids, this is Mr. Walker," Miss Santos announced, her tone warm but firm. "He's going to be helping out at the center for a while. Mr. Walker has a lot of experience in law enforcement, and he'll be here to answer any questions you might have about justice, fairness, and the role of the police." Tim felt a pang of discomfort at her words. Justice and fairness. He wondered if he was even qualified to speak on those topics anymore. "Hi, Mr. Walker," a boy with bright eyes and a mischievous grin called out, breaking the silence. Tim managed a small smile. "Hello, everyone. It's nice to meet you all." The children looked at him, some with open curiosity, others with guarded expressions. He couldn't blame them. He knew that to them, he was a stranger, a cop, and perhaps even someone who represented something they didn't trust. Miss Santos motioned for him to take a seat at the front of the room. "Why don't you start by telling them a bit about yourself, Tim?" Tim cleared his throat, feeling a sudden wave of self-consciousness. "Well, as Miss Santos mentioned, I've been a police officer for over 20 years. I've spent most of my career working in neighborhoods like Brilliant Grove, trying to keep people safe." One of the older kids, a girl with a piercing gaze, raised her hand. "You mean you've been working in rich neighborhoods?" Her question hung in the air, blunt and challenging. Tim felt the sting of her words, but he nodded, acknowledging the truth. "Yes," he admitted, "Brilliant Grove is a wealthy area, and that's where I've been assigned for most of my career." The girl crossed her arms, a smirk on her face. "Bet you don't see too many kids like us in Brilliant Grove, huh?" Tim felt his face flush with embarrassment. He knew that he couldn't deny it. "No, you're right. It's a different environment." The girl didn't say anything more, but her expression spoke volumes. She knew exactly what he was implying, and so did the other kids. He realized that they were judging him, sizing him up, and he couldn't blame them. In their eyes, he was just another cop, another authority figure who saw them as outsiders. As the morning wore on, Tim struggled to connect with the kids. He tried to tell them about his experiences on the force, hoping to engage them, but most of them seemed uninterested, their expressions skeptical. He felt like an intruder, an outsider in their world, and he knew that winning their trust would be harder than he had anticipated. Just before lunchtime, a familiar face walked into the room, Harriet. Tim's heart skipped a beat as he saw her, his guilt resurfacing in full force. She glanced at him, her expression unreadable, before taking a seat at the back of the room. For the rest of the session, Tim found it difficult to focus, his thoughts constantly drifting to Harriet. He wanted to apologize, to make things right, but he didn't know how. She was just a child, yet he felt as though he owed her the world. When the session ended, Tim approached Miss Santos, who was busy organizing papers at her desk. "Miss Santos," he began, hesitating slightly. I need to speak with Harriet. I owe her an apology." Miss Santos looked at him thoughtfully, her eyes softening. "Harriet has been through a lot, Tim, but if you're sincere, I think she'll be willing to listen." Tim nodded, feeling a surge of gratitude. "Thank you." As the last of the kids left the room, he approached Harriet, who was gathering her things. "Harriet," he said gently, his voice laced with regret, "can we talk?" Harriet looked up at him, her face guarded. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded, gesturing for him to sit beside her. Tim took a deep breath, knowing that this conversation would be one of the hardest he'd ever had, and as he began to speak, He felt the weight of his past actions pressing down on him, knowing that this was only the beginning of his journey towards redemption. The apology and the awakening. Tim took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest as he sat down beside Harriet. The weight of his guilt and shame felt almost unbearable, yet he knew that this was his chance to make things right, even if he wasn't entirely sure he deserved forgiveness. Harriet's expression was unreadable, a mix of apprehension and cautious curiosity. She looked at him with those same wide, intelligent eyes, but there was a guardedness to her gaze that hadn't been there before, an unspoken distrust that Tim knew he was responsible for. "Harriet," he began, his voice wavering slightly, "I don't even know where to start. What I did to you, it was wrong. There's no excuse for it." Harriet stared at him, silent, her small hands clutching her backpack straps. She didn't say anything, but her eyes were fixed on him, waiting for him to continue. Tim swallowed, feeling the weight of his words. "I judge you unfairly," he admitted, each word like a thorn pressing into his conscience. "I made assumptions based on, well, things that had nothing to do with you. And because of that, I treated you like a suspect, instead of like the innocent person you are." Harriet's face remained impassive, but her gaze softened just a little. Tim took this as a small sign to keep going. "When I saw you in that neighborhood, I didn't see you for who you really are," he continued. I saw my own biases, my own fears. I let those cloud my judgment, and I treated you as though you didn't belong. I'm so sorry, Harriet." Harriet looked away for a moment, her lips pressed tightly together. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but firm. "Do you know how scared I was?" she asked, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You treated me like a criminal. I thought I was in real trouble." Tim's heart broke as he listened to her. He had known, intellectually, that he had frightened her, but hearing it from her own mouth made it real in a way he hadn't fully grasped before. He had instilled fear in a child, a girl who had been doing nothing but trying to find her way home. The realization crushed him. "I can't imagine how scared you must have been," he said softly, his voice choked with emotion. "I can't undo what I did, Harriet, but I want you to know that I'm trying to learn, to understand, and to make amends. I'm here at the center because your father gave me a chance I know I probably don't deserve." Harriet studied him, her gaze searching. There was a long silence, filled only with the distant sounds of children playing outside, their laughter and voices a stark contrast to the tense atmosphere between them. "My dad says people can change," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "But he also says I have to really want it. Do you really want to change, Officer Walker?" Tim nodded, his eyes stinging. "More than anything, Harriet, I want to be a better person. I don't want to be the kind of person who makes others feel like they don't belong." Harriet considered his words for a moment before giving him a small nod. "Okay," she said quietly, "but you have to prove it, not just to me, but to everyone here." Tim understood. Words alone wouldn't be enough. He needed to show her, and everyone else, that he was committed to this journey, that he was willing to do the work required to change. In the weeks that followed, Tim began his volunteer work in earnest. Miss Santos had him assisting with a variety of activities at the center, tutoring, organizing events, and even leading discussions on justice and fairness. At first, the children were wary of him. They treated him with a polite distance, nodding when he spoke, but rarely engaging in conversation. He could feel their skepticism, the distrust that lingered in their eyes. They had seen people like him before, people in uniforms who made assumptions, who treated them differently because of where they came from or how they looked. But slowly, as the days turned into weeks, Tim began to see small changes. He noticed that some of the children were starting to approach him, asking questions or seeking his help with their assignments. He found himself drawn into conversations with them, learning about their lives, their struggles, and their dreams. He realized that many of these kids carried burdens that he had never imagined: poverty, discrimination, broken homes, and yet they held onto their hopes with a resilience that humbled him. One afternoon, Tim found himself sitting in on a workshop led by Miss Santos. The topic was community and belonging, and Miss Santos encouraged the children to share their experiences, their feelings of being accepted or not accepted in their own neighborhoods and schools. As Tim listened, he felt a pang of guilt as he recognized some of the prejudices he had held, prejudices that had hurt people like Harriet. A boy named Jaden, no older than 13, spoke up, his voice tinged with sadness. "I remember one time, I was just walking down the street with my mom, and this guy across the road just started staring at us. He looked at us like we didn't belong, like we were dangerous or something. I don't understand why people look at me like that." Tim felt his heart sink as he listened. It was as if he were hearing echoes of his own thoughts, thoughts that he had never questioned until now. He realized that, for Jaden and the other kids, these experiences were everyday occurrences, constant reminders that they were seen as different or suspicious. He could feel the weight of his own actions pressing down on him, a reminder of the pain he had contributed to. After the workshop, Tim approached Miss Santos, his voice filled with emotion. "I never understood what it feels like to be judged that way," he said, his voice trembling. "I've been so blind." Miss Santos looked at him with a mixture of empathy and resolve. "Tim, awareness is the first step, but it's not enough. You need to go deeper, to question why you held those beliefs, and to make a conscious effort to change." Tim nodded, feeling a surge of determination. He was beginning to understand that this journey wasn't just about atoning for one mistake. It was about reshaping his entire perspective, challenging the assumptions he had held for so long. It was a difficult, painful process, but he was committed to seeing it through. One day, a breakthrough came. As Tim was helping Harriet and a group of her friends with a community project, a mural they were painting on one of the center's walls, he noticed that the children were finally beginning to open up to him. Harriet, who had remained cautious around him, seemed more relaxed, her laughter ringing out as she painted a colorful tree on the wall. "Mr. Walker," Harriet said, smiling at him, "do you know how to paint?" Tim chuckled, feeling a warmth he hadn't felt in a long time. "Not really, but I can try," he replied, picking up a brush and dipping it into the paint. As he began to add his own brushstrokes to the mural, Harriet glanced at him with a mischievous smile. "You know, you're actually not so bad at this." Tim laughed, his heart swelling with gratitude. It was a small moment, but it felt monumental, a sign that Harriet was beginning to forgive him, that she was giving him a chance to prove himself. For the first time, Tim felt a sense of belonging in this community, a community he had once seen as other. He realized that these kids had taught him more in a few weeks than he had learned in 20 years on the force. They had shown him resilience, compassion, and the power of forgiveness, even when forgiveness was difficult. As they painted, Harriet looked up at him and said, "My dad says that everyone makes mistakes, but what matters is what you do after. Do you think you'll go back to being a cop?" The question caught Tim off guard. He hadn't thought about his career in weeks. He looked at Harriet, his mind racing as he considered his answer. "I don't know, Harriet," he admitted. "I've spent my life in law enforcement, but I'm not sure that's who I want to be anymore. I think I want to help people in a different way, maybe even help people understand each other better." Harriet nodded thoughtfully, a small smile on her face. "Well, whatever you decide, I think you'll be good at it." Tim felt a surge of hope at her words. For so long, he had defined himself by his badge, by his role as an enforcer of the law. But now he realized that there was so much more he could do, so many more ways he could contribute to his community. As the sun began to set and the children packed up their paint supplies, Tim looked at the mural they had created together. It was a vibrant tapestry of colors, filled with symbols of unity, strength, and hope. In that moment, he felt a profound sense of purpose, a realization that he had found a new path, a path rooted not in authority but in understanding. And as he watched Harriet and her friends walk away, laughing and talking, he knew that this was only the beginning. He had a long journey ahead, but for the first time in his life, he was ready to walk it. a new purpose. Months had passed since Tim Walker had started his journey of redemption at the Richards Family Center for Youth Empowerment, and in that time, he had undergone a transformation he couldn't have anticipated. Each day at the center had brought new challenges, but also moments of profound learning and connection. For the first time in his life, Tim felt like he was truly seeing the world and himself clearly. In the beginning, he had felt like an outsider, an intruder in a community he didn't understand. But now he was part of it. He had developed relationships with the children, earning their trust bit by bit, and learning from them in ways he hadn't thought possible. He had become a mentor, a teacher, and a friend. Harriet and her friends no longer looked at him with suspicion. They welcomed him into their lives, allowing him to witness their struggles, their resilience, and their dreams. But Tim knew his journey wasn't complete. He had started to ask himself the hard questions about his role as a police officer, about the biases he had held, and about the kind of man he wanted to be moving forward. The community center had taught him that there were other ways to make a difference, ways that didn't rely on authority or control, but rather on empathy and understanding. One afternoon, while helping the kids organize a small neighborhood event, Tim was approached by James Richards. The man, dressed in his usual sharp suit, had a calm but intense look in his eyes as he regarded Tim. "Tim," James said, extending his hand, "I wanted to thank you." Tim was taken aback. He shook James's hand, nodding respectfully. "Thank you, Mr. Richards, but I don't think I've done enough yet." James smiled, a small but genuine smile. "Harriet has told me a lot about the work you've been doing here, about how you've helped her and the other kids. You may not realize it, but you're making a real difference." Tim looked down, a sense of humility washing over him. "I never imagined it would be like this," he admitted. "I came here expecting to, I don't know, pay my dues, and maybe feel a little better about myself. But these kids, they've changed me." James nodded, his expression softening. "That's what this place does. It changes people, often in ways they don't expect. But the question is, what are you going to do with that change, Tim?" The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Tim had been avoiding the subject of his future, uncertain about what path he should take. His suspension from the police force was nearing its end, and he knew that Chief Dawson would soon be calling him back to duty. But deep down, he wasn't sure if he could go back to the life he once knew, the life that now felt so distant, so foreign. "I don't know," Tim replied, his voice filled with uncertainty. "Being a cop, it's all I've ever known. But after everything I've learned here, I'm not sure I can go back to that. I'm not sure I can look at the world the same way anymore." James placed a hand on Tim's shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. "Change is hard, Tim. But sometimes, stepping away from what we know is the only way we can truly grow. I think you'd make an incredible advocate, someone who could bridge the gap between law enforcement and communities like this one." Tim looked at James, the weight of his words settling over him. Advocate. It wasn't a word he had ever associated with himself, but now it resonated deeply. He realized that he didn't have to abandon his sense of duty or his commitment to justice. He could still serve his community, but in a way that fostered understanding rather than division, compassion rather than control. A week later, the decision. The next morning, Tim received a call from Chief Dawson. The suspension was officially lifted, and he was welcome to return to his post in Brilliant Grove. Chief Dawson's tone was warm, even congratulatory, as he informed Tim that he could resume his duties effective immediately. But as Tim listened to the chief, he felt a strange detachment, as though he were listening to a life that no longer belonged to him. The idea of returning to Brilliant Grove, of slipping back into the familiar routine, no longer held the same appeal. He realized that he had changed too much to go back. After a long pause, Tim cleared his throat. "Chief, I need to talk to you about something." Chief Dawson was silent, waiting. Tim took a deep breath and began. "I don't think I can come back," he said, the words tumbling out with a surprising sense of finality. "Working at the center, being around those kids, it's changed me. I can't go back to being the person I was before. I don't think I belong in Brilliant Grove anymore." The chief was silent for a moment, processing Tim's words. "Walker, you're one of the best officers we've had. Are you sure about this?" Tim nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief wash over him. "Yes, sir. I think I can do more outside of the force. I want to work with the community, help bridge the gap between people and the police. Maybe even educate other officers on the things I've learned here." There was a long silence on the other end of the line before the chief finally spoke, his voice filled with resignation, but also a note of respect. "I understand, Tim. It takes courage to walk away from something you've known your whole life. I'm proud of you, and I wish you the best of luck." As Tim hung up the phone, he felt a profound sense of freedom. He was no longer Officer Walker of the Brilliant Grove precinct. He was just Tim, a man trying to make a difference in a world that he was only beginning to understand. 6 months later, a new role. 6 months after leaving the police force, Tim had settled into his new role as a community liaison and advocate, working to improve relations between law enforcement and underprivileged communities. His job was challenging, often frustrating, but he found it deeply fulfilling. He worked with both the police and the community, organizing workshops, leading discussions, and helping bridge the chasm of misunderstanding and mistrust that separated the two. He spent his days at the Richards Family Center, running programs that taught children about their rights, encouraging them to engage in their communities, and instilling in them a sense of hope and agency. He also began leading workshops for police officers, sharing his own story, his mistakes, and the lessons he had learned. He talked about biases, about assumptions, and about the importance of empathy in their line of work. The first few sessions had been met with resistance. Some officers scoffed, others openly questioned his approach, but gradually his story began to resonate. Officers listened as he recounted his experience with Harriet, his encounter with James Richards, and the months he had spent at the center. They began to see him not as a former cop, but as someone who had been willing to change, to learn, and to grow. One afternoon, after a particularly intense workshop, a young officer approached Tim, his expression thoughtful. "Walker," he said hesitantly, "I just wanted to say, your story really got to me. I never thought about things the way you described them, but I think I understand now. Thank you." Tim smiled, clapping the officer on the shoulder. "That means a lot," he replied. "Just remember, everyone has a story, and sometimes it's our job to listen before we judge." A closing chapter. One evening, as Tim was wrapping up his day at the center, he felt a small hand tug at his sleeve. He turned to see Harriet standing beside him, a shy smile on her face. "Hi, Mr. Walker," she said, her voice cheerful. "Hi, Harriet," Tim replied, smiling down at her. "What's up?" Harriet hesitated, looking at him with a mixture of gratitude and pride. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said softly. "Thank you for listening to us, for caring. You're different now, and I think it's because you decided to see things the way we see them." Tim felt a lump form in his throat, the enormity of her words settling over him. He knelt down to her level, looking her in the eyes. "Harriet, you and everyone here at the center have changed me in ways I can't even begin to explain. You all showed me a world I've been blind to. Thank you for giving me a second chance." Harriet grinned, a spark of joy in her eyes. Everyone deserves a second chance if they really want it. As she ran off to join her friends, Tim watched her go, a deep sense of peace settling over him. He had lost a career, but he had gained a new purpose, a purpose that filled him with a sense of fulfillment he hadn't felt in years. He realized that he was no longer defined by a badge, by authority, or by his past mistakes. Instead, he was defined by the people he served, by the lessons he had learned, and by the hope he carried forward. And as he left the center that night, he knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be, no longer Officer Walker, but simply Tim, a man who had learned the true meaning of justice, empathy, and redemption.